welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening. This is the Aspen City Council work session for May 2nd. I can't believe it's already May.
Yeah,
2022. Tonight's agenda, we have short-term rental regulatory framework, final review, and then we have boards and commissions interviews. And we're going to get right into our agenda. So we've got Philip and Haley here with us.
Hello.
Thank you, Mayor Tory and Council. For the record, I'm Philip Supino. I'm the Community Development Director.
Haley Hart, Long Range Planner.
And we are here to discuss what the Mayor described, the regulatory framework for short-term rentals. We have been discussing this topic for a number of months. This particular scope of work goes back to a November 16th work session of 2021. We've been discussing short-term rentals in a number of different ways along with the Finance Department since the fall of 2020. So we see this as the culmination of more than a year and a half's worth of work on this topic. And we're excited to present what we think is a suite of regulations that respond directly to Council's input on the subject, the community's input on the subject, and reflect best practices from destination mountain communities around the West. With your permission, Mayor Tory, I'd like to share a presentation.
Please.
Excellent. So staff work on these regulations began in earnest in December of 2021. We met with Council in January, February, March, and twice in April to discuss policies and specific regulatory responses to short-term rentals. We are now, as the Mayor said, on the second day of May. We plan on coming back to Council for additional work sessions on May 9th and again on May 23rd. May 9th, we'll be discussing the summary of community engagement that we have conducted over the last 3 months. And May 23rd will be this same type of discussion, the regulatory framework around the residential building side of the moratorium project. You can see here we have 2 Planning and Zoning Commission meetings scheduled for May 17th and June 7th. Those are again for short-term rentals and residential building respectively. The land use code requires that prior to Council entertaining land use code amendments, P&Z be afforded an opportunity to review and comment upon those amendments, and so we will do that in those meetings. And then we plan on bringing first reading of short-term rentals, including tonight's comments and P&Z's comments on the 17th, back to Council on May 24th for first reading. Residential building first reading is scheduled for June 14th, and second reading for both projects is scheduled for June 28th. So that's a high-level overview of where we are in the process. Councilmember Mesro looks like he has a question.
Yeah. So we've got kind of our 4 buckets. This is one of the buckets. The other 3 are all in the residential space. We'll see all 3 of those buckets on the 23rd?
Correct.
All right.
Yes.
Giddy up.
Yes.
It's going to be a short one.
A lot of heavy lifting here in the
Okay.
next few days. Think of them as, buckets of ice cold water, which will be dumped on your head in public meetings. Yeah.
Great.
Just as a reminder, again, how staff has conceived of regulating short-term rentals fall into 6 primary categories. This is a reminder for you from previous discussions. I won't go into much detail. Suffice to say, Council has supported staff develop regulations in all 6 of these categories, and we have done so. Excuse me. Since we met on March 1st, staff's work has focused in 4 major areas, working with our Technical Advisory Committee. We've had 5 meetings, more than 90 minutes apiece, where we discussed zoning, financials, permitting, and then some specific topics like permit caps and transferability and program management. So what's going on administratively once these regulations are in place. That setting has been a tremendous asset for staff in all of our work, both our best practices research as well as developing these regulations and helping understand how the market functions locally. We produced a case studies report, which Council reviewed in the April 11th packet. We've been working closely with our consultants on the fee nexus study, reviewing our case studies report, as well as assisting in identifying and developing best practices to implement here in Aspen. And on the engagement side, aside from the Technical Advisory Committee, we have continued to conduct engagement, including open house, 2 focus groups, a second online survey, and providing what was essentially this presentation last week in front of the ACRA board. And we got some really good feedback in that setting as well. Tonight, specifically, we're looking for direction on 5 final topics, 5 final questions to help shape our ordinances, as well as buy-in again on the larger framework which we've sort of been working towards throughout these meetings over the last few months. So there's a number of details, topics within the regulations which we've discussed previously, which we do not plan on outlining tonight. They were outlined in the memo. They've been outlined in previous discussions. And so we're sort of taking for granted that the direction we've gotten from council on, up to this point on some of these topics still stands. And with the direction on these 5 final topics and buy-in on the sort of, again, the larger overview, we plan on finishing the development of that ordinance prior to going to P&Z on the 17th. Those 5 topics are the number of permits, or the cap on the number of permits in residential zone districts, how permits are allocated under a capped system, grandfathering or lottery, whether or not different permit types should have a limitation on the number of rental nights per year, how we should think about maximum occupancy based upon bedroom count, and whether or not to implement a use it or lose it policy for specific permit types. Any questions on the discussion to this point or the process to this point before we get into the details? Excellent. So question number 1, what should the cap for short-term rental permits in residential zones be? There are some specific policy outcomes to which the cap system is tied. I think broadly, the caps are essential, one of the essential tools for responding to council and community concern around neighborhood character, the intensity of short-term rental as a land use within our community, specifically in residential zone districts. And on the other side, an acknowledgement that there should be some of this use in the community because it supports our lodging bed base. It has significant economic benefits, not only for individual property owners, but for the industry that is built up around the management of those properties, and for the community broadly in terms of sales tax receipts, lodging tax receipts, and the support of our tourist economy. And we're interested broadly in using caps to strike that appropriate balance. And so in a way, really the entire regulatory system hinges upon the use of caps to achieve complementary policy goals. And as described in the memo, staff's recommendation for this particular tool is a cap at 75% of the existing short-term rental permits in applicable residential zone districts as described in the memo. And some data to support your thinking about this. These numbers are reflected in different portions of your packet, both the memo and the maps that were included in the exhibits. Haley, do you mind just walking us through these numbers briefly?
Sure. So we arrived at these numbers by zone district by looking at the total residential units and creating a percentage of what is existing in the short-term rental permits from Pete's data. So in looking at the table that was also an exhibit, it's sort of a high-level overview of what the number of capped short-term rental permits would look like at 75%, 50%, and 25% of what is existing to residential units. So those are the numbers that are in front of you right now. So right now, if you exclude the lodge and commercial core overlay and those districts as recommended, you get to 11% of all residential units are currently short-term rentals. So if you were to cap that at 11% or the 535% at 75, you would arrive at 398 total short-term rentals. That would decrease it to 8% of the residential units in those districts. Again, 50%, you get 268, that's 5% of all residential units. And then if you were to cap it at 25%, 133, 3% of residential units. We feel that with your direction of wanting to move forward with some sort of cap, 75% would decrease enough to feel an impact in those residential zones, but would still continue for an allowed diverse lodging base, and would still provide that sort of economic viability for those who short-term their property.
I think what's interesting is the top line excludes owner-occupied STRs and lodging exempt.
That's correct.
Skippy?
I was just gonna ask, I know you kind of started talking about it. What I think I heard you saying is the 75% is sort of a rough approximation of a number that can get at what you heard here, which is a slight reduction. Is that a fair understanding of how we arrived at 75%?
Yes.
Okay.
And to further illustrate the mayor's question a little bit, this number again, 535, as the basis for these three different scenarios, it would exclude owner-occupied permits, which would be exempted, unlimited in any zone district, right? It would exclude short-term rentals that currently exist or would exist in the future in the commercial core, commercial lodge zone districts. And it excludes a big chunk of the existing condominiumized lodging product short-term rental that we have in the community now. So what that number is reflecting is residential zone districts. And so that 11% should not be thought of as the aggregate number in the entire community, nor should any of the resulting 75, 50, or 25% numbers. Those would not be the aggregate number in the community. We're focused specifically on residential zone districts.
And you might recall in the previous data package sent for the April meeting, the total amount is 16%. So again, this is taking out that 5% that is within the lodge, commercial core, things that are like the Gant, Aspen Alps. So this is only looking at residential units.
Thoughts?
Yeah, it seems to me, are those,
No, Ward, Howinston.
seems to me that the density, that the maps that are shown, are those excluding the owner-occupied? Are those just the number that are there?
A little bit of both. So the existing condition in each of the residential zone districts may include current short-term rentals that could be an owner-occupied unit. So there may be, John Q. Public may operate a short-term rental in the R6 that's showing up in the existing condition map. And that, if he continues to operate as a short-term rental, would be a unit under the new scenario, but it would be exempted from the 75% cap. So we don't, because we don't have data about owner-occupied versus non-owner-occupied, we can't make an assessment on a zone-by-zone basis of how many units under the current regulations could be classified as owner-occupied and would therefore carry forward under the cap. So we're frankly sort of shooting in the dark here with respect to whether the number's 1 in a zone district that could be an owner-occupied exempted short-term rental under the new regulations, or if there's 10. And I understand that that's not a particularly helpful response, but we just don't have the data to understand.
Yeah, I can appreciate that, but when I look at R6 and R15, it seems that's where the most density is, particularly in R6. And I just wonder if targeting all across the board a 75% percentage is too broad, maybe to be more surgical and focus on the areas that are closer into town that have a higher density, particularly R6 and to some degree R15, but R6 really jumps out to me. And one of the things that I would like to gauge this by is how many complaints are there? Like in R3, there's one, and there's just not a lot in some areas where a 75% or 25% reduction really makes any sense, but instead of looking at clumping them all together to be more surgical, and so my approach would be to look closely at R6 and R15. R15A just has a few, looks like a cluster in one certain area, but to be surgical, particularly where they're really dense.
Would the suggestion then be to have a tighter cap in the R6 and the R15 than in other zone districts? Is that what you mean by more surgical?
Yes, I would, if we have X number, what are they in, let me see. We have 109 in R6 and 62 in R15. That those seem to be places that are closer, and particularly 6, that could be reduced, because I'm particularly concerned in the impact that STRs have on the neighborhoods and the neighborhood character and the fabric of the community. And it seems to me as R6 is where that is most concentrated.
Understood. The R15 zone district has 145,
Sorry, which one?
RMF, excuse me.
Yeah, RMF actually has a higher percentage. If you look at Exhibit B, that gives you the sort of the overview of all of them, that's 18%, whereas R15 is 9%, and RMF has 254 existing.
And so
Didn't see a map on the RMF.
if we're interested in focusing on the higher intensity neighborhoods as places for greater reduction than lower intensity neighborhoods, would you then favor a tighter or more restrictive cap in the RMF as well?
Yeah, I don't see it. Did I just miss it that there is a map for RMF? Did I miss that?
This one?
That's East End, close to, what page is that on?
Say 38.
This?
Yeah. That's one that we were gonna treat as lodging, I think. Or we were gonna treat that as neighborhood?
That's
Yeah.
correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't see that in the graph under question 1, but maybe it's there and I just missed it, but.
RMF. Are you talking about in the
There,
memo?
I see it, sorry, 254. Yeah, there are a lot in that area.
Yeah.
Ward, can I ask a clarifying question? Is your suggestion that, you haven't said this yet, but assuming, 75% makes sense for residential or for these areas, but you're saying for the higher intensity ones, the R15, RMF, and R6, maybe we go to 50%? Or are you saying we should have the average still be 75, but to reach that, we would be more permissive in the ones that are not those 3 and more restrictive in the ones that are those 3?
Yeah, those 3 are where I would focus.
But would you say 75 for all and then 50 for those 3, or would you try to balance it to 75?
Yeah, I sense that the biggest impact is on where the highest density is. So I'm not sure we don't have, what we really need is an overall number of, when we exempt the owner occupied and all the lodge district stuff, that condo hotels and lodges have already been exempted in this 535 number, correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
And I don't know if we'll be able to figure out what are the owner-occupied rentals until we start the new permitting system.
Yeah, and so, I mean, this jumps ahead a few sections, but when we get to putting a cap on, and there was observations from other communities where when you have the fee structure and the new regulations, some people will choose not to apply for a vacation rental or STR permit, whatever we're going to call this new creature. So perhaps as those people apply for those permits, and we get more granular detail on if they're owner occupied, and that would give us, we'd be more informed in making a cap number, knowing exactly what that number is.
That's exactly right. And part of staff's thinking in arriving at the recommended 75% across the board was a recognition of a couple of those dynamics you described. One is that concept of instant attrition. We do expect that the number would go down with the implementation of regulations, regardless of a cap. Secondarily, staff recognizes that we will learn more about the location and permit type of all the STRs in town when the new regulations are implemented, and do not believe this is our last pass at arriving at a capped number for the community or for an individual zone district. We believe we'll be having this discussion again. Maybe we can wait 2 years on that, but we will be having this discussion again.
Yeah.
And so with those ideas, with those concepts in mind, that was a significant contributor to staff's recommendation for a sort of across-the-board number. But I understand what you're suggesting about intensity of use and being responsive to that with a tighter number. So I look forward to other council comments on that specific topic.
And then just one final comment, we've had a lot of work sessions on this, but quite a while ago you presented a heat map of where they are. And I had asked, and I would be interested in seeing what the heat map of complaints is as well.
It's our understanding we have fewer than a dozen complaints a year.
Okay.
And so I don't, that level of data would feel anecdotal from a spatial standpoint, in my estimation. We know of one property where there are consistent complaints, and that property's been dealt with. And beyond that, it's infrequent and very much dispersed. So I don't know how instructive that would be.
Yeah, and Skip, you in a direct answer, I don't know if a 25% reduction across the board or just targeting those 3 areas with the highest density. I don't have that answer. I'd like to see how many owner occupied there are. Not lock in at this point.
Got it.
More comments, Skippy?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Philip, I appreciate you saying that, we don't know, and we're going to have to learn as we go with new regulations. I completely agree with you. To my mind, this is a good starting point. The rationale that you provided of approximating our comments with a number, I think, is the right balance. But I also recognize, you say there'll be some immediate attrition. There will be some. I don't anticipate a lot. I also anticipate that those units that will remain will have a higher average intensity of use as STRs. So we may see the overall, total heads per bed, per year in aggregate stay the same, even if the number of units go down, right? We just don't know. So Ward, I'm open to your comment for the reasons you gave. I'd like to hear staff flush out the question of how we arrive at that. I'm also very comfortable just saying 75 across the board for the reasons you suggested, but I definitely want to put into our workflow, and I think 2 years is probably about the right time frame of coming back to look at this number. ACRA was in here. I think you guys were in the room for that the other day of really studying this, what is over-tourism, right? And so I think to arrive at a more objective, quantifiable number that can inform what this cap is, coupled with what Ward said, well, what in the real world is the use around residential and lodge exempt, to arrive at a goal number. And then be able to have that more detailed information about, well, where are we getting the most complaints? Where are we getting the most complaints per night stay, right? Because we're obviously going to get more complaints for places that have a lot more use or a lot more STRs. But then also to start to think about, even if we have that perfect objective number, it's always a moving target. It's a moving target because, the lodging infrastructure will change. We'll probably continue to lose the last few remaining small affordable lodges. We're also going to be gaining some new big lodges, expensive lodges in the near future. That's going to change that ratio. We'll have better info on that intensity of use, right? And then the last thing is bedroom size, right? Like we could say 500 STRs, but if they're all studios versus all 6-bedroom homes, totally different universe in terms of what is over tourism. So I'm supportive of staff's recommendation. I'm open to looking at what Ward suggested. But the main point I wanted to make is I want to have in our work plan, 2 years-ish from now, looking at that with what is over tourism with ACRA and taking into account lodging, intensity use, and average bedroom size.
Understood. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, thanks. I peppered Philip with a few questions today by email to get ready for tonight's meeting. And one of the questions I asked is kind of, how many more guests might we expect in town if we're using the 2 per bedroom standard that's kind of plus 1 that's suggested? And just using the numbers of non-owner-occupied STRs on our current slide is like 398. And so times 2.5 bedrooms was the average Philip used to answer me per STR, comes out to 985 bedrooms times 2 people per bedroom, forget the plus 1, equals 1,970 people who might be visiting Aspen during the 4th of July or Christmas week, that are essentially not mitigated for in our traditional mitigation scheme of growth management. That's an awful lot of people. And I also had asked about any sort of industry standards that exist on hotel rooms, knowing it's not apples to apples. And Philip has assured me that we don't have those sort of metrics. We base it on the size of a property and the number of rooms they're going to have and things like that. But I was just kind of recalling more from actually the Limelight approvals a long time ago. And they were talking about they were going to stay a 3-star property. It wasn't going to go high end. And one of the lines of demarcation was whether or not a hotel had room service or whether they would have a full-time kitchen and things like this, which the original Limelight proposal didn't have. And so I do recall that there was, this kind of ratio with a standard hotel that they were using in that hearing. That a luxury hotel, you're going to have 1 employee per 3 guests, and at a more moderate hotel, you'd have 1 employee for 5 guests or something like that. I really don't know, and that's why we're doing further work to understand employment demand, both in the actual residence itself that's being rented, as well as demands onto the commercial core for increased services. But it just strikes me that that's an awful lot of people as we head into these discussions about over-tourism, because it seems most likely that people are going to be short-terming their rental units when the most income is potential from there, and then maybe perhaps when it's their own best times to want to travel, to take a 2-week vacation at Christmas or over July or things like that. So I really am just looking at the impact on a community that does not have the workforce to sustain itself today, and that our down valley no longer is providing that naturally occurring free market housing that it has in the past. And I don't think most of the business community or our town has really woken up to what all that change is meaning. But when you're up to, $500,000 homes in Glenwood Springs that are 40 years old and are 700 square feet, you're really not talking about housing the middle class or the traditional lower income workforce that service industry really demands. So those are really the concerns that fund the background of what I'm looking at. And so I looked at staff's recommendations and thought they were really very reasonable and actually somewhat generous, given the challenges that we're facing. So I would be happy to look at other proposals for drilling down a little further, but I think our staff has really tried to reach a good balance point where we are right now and with what we know right now. I can certainly see Ward's logic in saying that, look, we have some zones where they're not overrun by STRs now. Should we perhaps have a lower limit there before they get overrun? And should we look at places where there's perhaps more impact and see if there should be a lower number there? But again, I can understand staff's recommendation. I'm not opposed to staff's recommendation. But again, that's part of what I'm looking at in terms of impacts and appropriateness. I do think the comments that are made about STR permits currently, that some may have been applied for by people, and this is from a past meeting, who did not actually own the property but wanted to get a permit and then approach the owner to get the permit, and that once the regulations are in effect, there may be a number of homeowners who find out their properties are not up to code for health and safety standards for being able to be even eligible for a permit without investing a certain amount of money in upgrading the facilities. So I can understand where you're coming from now, and I do think it'll be a crush when it comes to who has the permits, who gets the permits, and who doesn't get the permit. It's going to take a lot of sorting out and really in-depth investigation to understand that if somebody, and we may want to make some interim rules, I think, for the first year or two of activity, so that, you know, there was discussions of what is vacant and what is owner-occupied, but the question of, well, if somebody gets that STR permit and doesn't use it in 6 or 9 months, perhaps they forfeit it in the first year, rather than no tax receipts for 2 years going forward. That would seem like speculation to me, if someone just holding on to a permit just in case, and perhaps denying an active user an ability. And so I think that, you know, you may want to think about how we evaluate the actual usage of the permits in the first year for reallocation, should they not be being used. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. John?
Yeah, I just want to thank ComDev for, I think, very thorough packet that explains.
Mike.
Thank you.
Just want to thank ComDev for a very thorough packet. Clearly defines what we're up against, and I like the direction it's going. And thanks for your concerns, Rachel and Ward.
Thanks, John. My input on this is that I appreciate the staff recommendation. I probably would be looking at a 10. I kind of did my math in reverse. I looked at what is my tolerance level, what do I think the community tolerance level is, and so I actually was going backwards at 10%. And as I was looking and walking around some neighborhoods and thinking about that impact, 1 out of 10, again, not owner occupied, not the lodging zone, et cetera, but the residential zone. So for me, I would be open to greater than 75 where you landed on. I would be working my math from the 10%.
Understood.
And that's my suggestion for consideration. I do appreciate the recommendation. I think that it's appropriate. But again, I haven't felt the crush of this this density or intensity. So I'm a little bit more open to a little higher cap than the 398 number. So I kind of was looking at 10% for neighborhood impacts. That's kind of where it felt to me.
Councilmember Doyle, in your comments, were you suggesting that you supported the staff recommendation, or did you have another number that you favored?
No, I do support staff recommendation. I thought it was well reasoned.
I just want to fill up a question as a follow-up. Do we have any rough idea of how many owner-occupied STR permits you're anticipating or have now? Or I guess there's very little way to tell.
We don't, and I have considered in the intervening months whether we could use short-term rental permit data and assessors data or voter registration data to try and get close. And working with a local consultant, we really struggled to figure out how we could present a number
Yeah.
that felt even sort of remotely accurate. And in lieu of that, we haven't done that
Yeah,
analysis.
and I can understand. I was just kind of asking because, I was coming up with the 1,970 number if they're all full at the same time, and kind of trying to figure out, well, if there's 200 owner-occupied or there's 600, that would marginally increase that number or double it, and there's, as you say, there's just no way to know right now.
Just a thought, and this is totally crystal ball, but I would put forth that the number of owner-occupied STRs will go up. Nothing to do with these regulations. These regulations don't change the equation. It's just that more people are able to work remote. And if you can rent out your place and continue to work somewhere else, it's nice to see other places on that dime. I think it'll go up. The flip side, though, is that a lot of the lodge things that are really bought primarily as investments will see more use on the other side, where people are going to travel here more because they can work from here. So where that shakes out, I don't know, but that'd be my guess.
Okay. Thank you. Again, I was just kind of wondering what kind of totality of numbers, unmitigated, potentially come into our community. I mean, we already see the different resistance against building affordable housing at the lumberyard to make up for some of our lost workforce. And Colorado Sun had a pretty significant article about the opposition Vail is facing towards more workforce housing and other communities. And so that's just kind of, how do we balance that expectation of the guest who is going to be paying a pretty penny to stay here for that week and then find out, the restaurants are closing early or they're only open 5 nights a week or, 3 of the lifts aren't open because we don't have the ski patrollers anymore. And, the type of things that are actually shutting down and changing resorts already. And as this gets to be more, how do you ever begin to make up for the workforce that we've lost because of pricing of free market real estate throughout the valley?
It's in my professional experience in this community, we often default to discussing land use matters from what I'll call a qualitative standpoint, which has tons of value and merit and is important. And I look forward to using Ms. Hart's skills, having brought her onto the planning staff, to look in a little more quantitative way on the relationship between some of our economic objectives as a community and how we choose to use land, and short-term rentals is absolutely a component of that. What I'm hearing at the council table at this point is a majority of 3 who support the staff recommendation, and so in lieu of additional discussion around that, I'd like to get to the other questions for council this evening, and that 75% number will get carried forward into the ordinance for further discussion at first reading if necessary. Is that all right with you, Mr. Mayor?
That sounds appropriate. I do have one more question about this, though. When we start talking about enforcement, compliance, and regulation, is this going to be our greatest challenge, regulating this?
In terms of the number of short-term rentals operating?
Yes.
I don't believe so. I think that our greatest challenge will be verifying owner occupancy or verifying the natural person applicant and sort of pulling the veil off a little bit of some property ownership. That will be challenging.
Okay.
We don't say veil in this chamber.
I'm sorry. And I think another challenge that we look forward to, and I'll speak for the finance department here, is tax compliance and making sure that we're getting as high a level of tax compliance as possible.
Great. Thank you for that. I will say that carrying forward the 75 is great. I appreciate that. I am going to be considering that as we look at the total package and stuff. So I may come back at first reading and speak to council members about that cap again.
Thank you for that discussion. So question number 2, how should permits in capped zones be allocated? So again, policy outcomes, why are we discussing this? We want to support the zone district cap model. And that means we have to be able to give permits to people when there's a limited supply of permits. We want to ensure that balance of land uses that we've been discussing for the last few months. And acknowledge that some of these short-term rentals, some of these residential properties in our community are primarily lodging properties at this point. Should they have a permit and they're a vacant property, that is contributing more to our lodging bed base than it is contributing to our community housing base. Providing owner occupants an opportunity to short-term from time to time, and to support established lodging through the cap exemptions that we've discussed previously. And so with those policy objectives in mind, staff recommends the grandfathering and attrition system, relying on non-transferability, abandonment, enforcement, and this idea of instant attrition to arrive at the cap number over time. We've discussed the lottery system in this setting in recent weeks, so I won't run through that as a reminder again. Happy to support any discussion that council has about the best approach here for the second question.
John?
Yeah, once again, I think the packet makes it pretty easy to make the call here, and I'm going to go with staff recommendation. Just makes it easier for the people that already have permits not to claim foul, and based on what you've written, we will lose these permits to attrition. And I do like Rachel's suggestion of maybe making it just 1 year of non-use instead of 2.
Thanks, John. Other input here? Rachel?
Yeah, I think that grandfathering is going to have a far smoother time for implementation than a lottery would have. And I can see folks putting into a lottery, whether they really have an intention to or not, but thinking that that way I'll start to have my grandfathered license, whether I'm going to rent this year or 2 years from now. Now, I realize we're trying to have rules to prevent that, but I do think a lottery would start to just encourage does anybody remember when they were starting to sell cell phone technology and it was all over the radio to put in your application because you could maybe own some of this bandwidth that they're auctioning off, I mean, it's just like everybody was encouraged to put in. So I'd be a little nervous about that. I do think there's a little bit of challenge with really discussing how grandfathering works. Because or the wait list perhaps is the better side of it. And I only can think about the housing office's experience over time is that, if you have a wait list for these type of units and one of those units come up, all of a sudden you're calling people and it's like, do you wait for them to get back to you 3 days or 7 days before you call the next person? And, oh, I've left town. Oh, I've sold a few years ago. Oh, I did this. So it's very, very hard to keep the wait list up to current in any sort of reasonable manner. And so I think that would be a bit of a challenge going forward. I mean, people would have to reaffirm every year they're still eligible, they're interested, or something along those lines. But
that's a great suggestion for some contents for our program guidelines, and something that I know Haley spent some time discussing other communities.
How exactly that runs in a fair way and a transparent way. The question becomes, do you really have a wait list for future permits, or do you have lotteries for future permits? So that's something to think about. I guess the other thing I really do have a little concern with is that perhaps people caught in what we would call the transition in the moratorium taking effect of whether they were in a position to know that they wanted to short-term rental at that time period, whether the conditions we set that it had not been rented long-term in the future or past, immediate, or other things of whether for owner-occupied we're you know, how each one of these policies connects is a part of a challenge in answering this. But it's referenced that folks may choose to move from owner-occupied permit to a full-time STR permit if they're not getting what they need out of the owner-occupied permit in terms of length of time that they're allowed to rent. But on the other hand, they would then be moving into a potential lottery system or a wait list that they didn't have a chance to access getting in on as the window shut, basically.
The way that we have conceived of that to this point is if council favors grandfathering and attrition as the system for allocating permits, an existing permit holder would be afforded the opportunity to apply for their 2023 grandfathered permit and indicate at that time whether they sought an owner-occupied permit or a non-owner-occupied permit. And they could choose what type of permit they wanted, and they would get that permit because they're being grandfathered into the system. So there's, staff would not be in a position to dictate to an operator the type of permit that they would be eligible for, so long as they meet the criteria. There is no residency criteria for the short-term rental permit, and so an owner-occupant could choose to go that route if they wanted to rent more than the duration limit. If they meet the owner-occupancy criteria and they want to pay a lower permit fee, they can choose the owner-occupied path. But once that round of permitting has been completed,
Yes.
it's locked in at that point.
Okay. And if that round of grandfathered permitting ended up being less than the recommended caps, you would then start to hold a lottery or create a wait list?
First come, first served basis. So if we did not reach a cap in his own district and Jane Q, short-term rental operator, called and said, can I get a short-term rental permit? We would say, yes, here's the permit application. You may fill it out and apply for this permit.
Okay, and then I guess the last question would be, would we have a process for dealing with people who had applied for a permit as the window was closing and the week and whatever we all want to call it, but were denied? Would they be right back into a regular lottery, or would they be like, wait, we tried to get a permit before and we should be given some consideration on that?
We have not considered consideration.
Okay.
If you have a valid 2020, are we calling them 22 permits? If you have a valid short-term rental permit right now, you would be grandfathered into the system. And if you didn't, then you could apply for the type of permit for which you want to be eligible. And now, bear in mind, we have the commercial core exemption, so that is a significant number of residential properties in town, and we have the owner-occupied exemption for the entire community where there is no cap. So we're talking about whether or not somebody tried to apply for a short-term rental permit with no duration limit and were denied for whatever reason, and whether or not they should be given consideration to get into the grandfathering system. And with the integrity of the grandfathering system in mind, I would not recommend letting people in after the door had been closed. But at least that's how we've thought about it.
Okay, I just thought I'd ask.
To this point, yeah.
I know it was an awkward time for all of us, and people were like, well, I'm still waiting to hear back from Pete Stryker, or I'm, hoping it was all meshed up together or not. And that's all I wanted to ask about. Thank you.
Other input?
Yeah, it's the idea that the number of permits in a zone is capped right now at what the current number is. And that's going to be our cap for now. So that people, as Rachel was saying, that have permits, have applied and have had them granted, they're grandmothered in. And to add, so let's just say you have 200 STR permits in Zone X. And when everybody turns in their requests for, after the moratorium is over October 1st or what, if we only have 175, then you're letting 25 more in. And those would be lottery or wait lists. I think that's a valid question to have, how you handle those people that had applied. I initially thought that to limit them at a lower number now and have a lottery, but the one chance at a lottery doesn't seem to be equitable either.
That's how staff has conceived of it.
Yeah, yeah. And abandonment, I think, needs to have some more study. I think, Rachel, I agree with you that to wait 2 years for somebody to abandon one might be too long. Use it or lose it, I like that idea. And, you know, maybe somebody has a vacation rental permit and they're using it as speculation. So I think based on the lodging and sales tax revenue, or that if they're not turning it in for X number, perhaps less than 2 years, that the attrition is accelerated through abandonment. That's a little bit more stringent than the 2 years that is suggested.
Sure. So just to be crystal clear, are you supporting staff's recommendation of the grandfathering system?
Grandmothering, yeah.
Excuse me, and thank you for deconstructing the patriarchy. We need to work on that in community development as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd rather see a decrease, but I think getting it to a lower number through attrition, we have to set that level.
Sure.
And if it's at 200 now, and we just said it's 175, we have to wait for the attrition. But just be a little bit more stringent on the abandonment.
Understood. Thank you.
Thanks, Ward.
Yeah, I think on balance, I support staff's recommendation across the board here. This was challenging for me when it came to grand peopling. You know, if we're saying we want to reduce over tourism, it's a little hard to say, well, let's keep it for a while. But I recognize what staff, I think, correctly points out, which is we don't know how this will shake out. We may see that attrition at the beginning. And so given that ambiguity, that known ambiguity, the ease of not upsetting the apple cart by changing the equation on people mid-property ownership, as much as from the community perspective, I find that challenging, I get it, and so I'm willing to accept that. I think the non-transferability piece is really important because it will, over time, dissolve the artificial inflation of property values if they are there due to short-term rental, which we have every reason to believe from commenters is there, but without harming those who have taken a bite of that apple, I guess, so to speak. As to abandonment, Rachel, I agree with your statement that a shorter period is good, say a year. The thing that gets a little sticky for me is if someone, for COVID or just because it's a gap year for their kid, wants to spend a year in their property, do they lose their permit for having spent time here? That doesn't quite seem right to me. So I don't want to overcomplicate it for you by adding all these qualifiers that staff has to check in on, and so I'd be okay with 2 years to avoid that for now. But I think what you said is smart, and so if there's a way to kind of deal with some of those edge case scenarios, then I would be open to that.
We might be able to look at adding a non-residency clause to that as well, so 1 year of non-use and non-residency.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost the reverse Caribbean vacation in the free market,
Sure.
right? We're having the affordable thing. That's just one thing I noticed there, but I agree shorter would be good. And then in terms of how to allocate permits as they become available, you know, I really don't have a big dog in the fight, whether it's wait list or lottery. They're both fair to some degree, and they have an expectation. My primary concern is not seeing a big ask every year in the budget for staff to be doing this. You know, this should not be a thing that is handled manually by a staff member. This is something that needs to be automated, and it can be relatively easily with a few functions. You know, we have their contact information, we have, you know, the list and the algorithm either for a lottery or picking the next one, and we set some parameter and expectation of when you get called by that automated email and phone call, you have 7 days to claim your prize or you go back in line, right? But I just want to see that automated. That's my main concern.
Understood, thank you.
Thanks. I as well, you've heard a lot of questions up here just on different aspects of staff recommendation. I support staff's recommendation. I actually kind of defer to you on this one. I hope that the research that you've done with other communities and how their processes have been handled over the last 2 years is helping inform you. And so I'm kind of deferring here, saying I trust that you're going to come back with best recommendations based on what your findings have been. The only thing that I would say about this is, once again, my main concern here is to make sure that people that actually live here in their homes, or if they're away for a year, I get that, that's no problem with me, but making sure that the people that are Aspenites and residents have the ability to get their permitting. I see this as really, these regulations are somewhat around a narrow window of the type of short-term rental that is detrimental to our community, and not all of them are. So I defer to you on this, and I appreciate staff's work on it.
Thank you. Question 3, this is about limits to annual rental nights for the 2 primary short-term rental types, owner-occupied short-term rental and short-term rental, or vacant short-term rental. Again, and we had this discussion in the last meeting, April 11th meeting, staff has conceived of owner-occupied short-term rentals as housing units first, part of our community housing matrix first, and short-term rentals second. And vacant short-term rentals, second homes, which are used on a short-term basis, as being primarily part of our lodging, our community lodging bed base, and secondarily as a potential housing opportunity for somebody, for an owner who's here some portion of the year. And so staff's recommendation is with that framing in mind, ensuring some economic benefit, some flexibility for owners who are interested in short-terming, while also supporting the lodging bed base with properties that, for all intents and purposes, function as lodging. And that again gets back to the balance that we seek with these regulations in our community between these competing land uses. Comparable communities have taken similar approaches to this. Again, it was critically important for staff to root these recommendations in best practices and our interpretation of adopted community policy, again, around housing and the tourist economy. And so with those policy priorities in mind, staff recommends a 90-day limit for owner-occupied permits and no limit for short-term rental permits. And again, we welcome discussion on that.
Thanks. While people are thinking a little bit, Philip, as we've had our conversation over the last couple weeks and months and in these different work sessions, I've brought up to you that, to me, this sounds inverse of, so can you talk to me a little bit more about that? For example, somebody who actually lives here, owner-occupied, wants to get out of their home, and for me, even a year, like things happen. People want to do something else. So, I'm all for it. So can you talk to me a little bit about that? I don't understand why we'd necessarily be limiting that, unless there's an exemption for some type of year sabbatical or whatever it might be, but.
Sure. Aside from the framing that we have conceived of around housing unit versus lodging unit, I guess the only other thing that I can add is, without an annual limit on nights for the owner-occupied permit, then the limit on nights is the 6 months in a day, or the primary residency requirement. And to be honest, and I don't have a totally firm grasp on this, but the criteria that we would establish for how one can receive an owner-occupied permit is showing that address on a state of Colorado tax return, or that's the address on your driver's license, or that's the address on your voter registration. And how, so then at that point, from a regulatory standpoint, we as regulators are deferring to those other regulatory agencies, the Department of Motor Vehicles, the State Department of Revenue, whomever it is, and their regulatory compliance regime to support our regulations, right? So if somebody has a driver's license in the state of Colorado that shows the address on their driver's license for which they seek a short-term rental permit, we're deferring to the state that they meet some criteria for residency. And so in that way, I feel like the community would then be sort of handing over some of that regulatory obligation to those other agencies. And we would be deferring to that 6 months, seemingly 6 months occupancy requirement to be their primary residence as the only governor on how that property is used. And so again, if council is concerned about the relationship between housing and lodging, I feel like this response, the staff recommended response, creates a little bit of a tighter sieve to make sure that there aren't properties that could apply for a resident occupied permit and get the benefit of having no cap, get the benefit of having a lower permit fee, and be able to operate anywhere in the community. We would have a little bit tighter sieve to make sure that they are in fact meeting those other community expectations around how they qualified for that permit in the first place.
Then my other question would be, why, how was 90 days chosen as the top of that cap?
It's the most
More
permissive,
generous.
it's the most permissive industry standard that we've found in our best practices research.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Other members? Rachel?
Yeah, no, you raise good points, Tori, but it is a challenge. At what point can someone in the future buy a home, register to vote here, and then really not live here, at all? I still pay my income taxes here, I have a phone number, it's cell phones from here. There'd be nothing that would keep an individual from having this as their primary residence while they live in New York City year-round, and not really live here. I was thinking about it. A good friend of mine, Cy Coleman, used to have a free market condo. And he eventually became a bit of an expatriate and had moved to Peru and was living in Cusco. And would come back and visit and stay with friends every now and then, and still registered to vote here and still considered himself an Aspenite. But eventually he sold the condo, and when he talked to the clerk's office, the county clerk's office, about voting, how do I vote? He would come and stay with friends here for the summer in the physics center and things like that. They told him that, because I live in Cusco now, I don't live in the U.S., and they said, well, you vote at your last known physical address in where you last had a physical presence. So he would continue to vote in Aspen but he hadn't lived in Aspen for years. So I think that's part of the challenge with what is resident occupancy, and why they're potentially limiting it, because otherwise you have people who lived here one day a year. I'm a resident, filed my food tax refund, I voted, and that's it. I have a driver's license for Colorado and one for China, or wherever they live. So I just don't see it as, I see, I would question whether 90 days should be 100 days, but I can't question whether there should be a limit on days for owner-occupied.
Yeah, and I will say, in talking with other communities, right, they see the owner-occupied route as a way for homeowners to help supplement income, for them to help cover costs when they're out of town for a few weeks here and there. It's not a full business, right? It's just part of their livelihood in having to be fortunate enough to have a home here, or, in Crested Butte or wherever. So I think that sort of speaks a little bit to what you were saying as well, is, it's a supplement to already having a great opportunity to live in the community. It's not a full compensation.
Yeah, thank you.
Board?
Yeah, I think what we're borrowing on is what Picken County and other communities have determined, take two of a list to qualify as owner-occupied. Reading through this, wondered if 90 days was too many. You say it's the most lenient, so I just question if that's too many. And I also wonder, I like, as Tori was talking, I started to write down exemptions, and he says exemptions. So if a person has an owner occupied, do they have a less stringent abandonment qualifications? Can they get an exemption if they're going to be out of town for an extended period of time?
That's a great suggestion. I don't know if we've conceived of
We
that.
haven't thought of that. Other communities don't. I think it's very granular detail for other communities who are doing this sort of owner-occupied route to take into consideration. So I have not heard of any, but that doesn't mean we can't consider it here.
And if there's no cap, though, then it's just sort of an administrative burden without benefit, because even if they abandon it, they can just get it again at any time.
Well, then get it again anytime if there are enough permits open in that zone.
Well, no,
But
he's
there's no
saying if they're
cap.
owner occupied, there's no cap.
Yeah.
So if they abandon their permit owner occupied, unless a cap was suddenly instituted on owner occupied, they'd just be able to apply the next year when they came back.
Yeah, I think the only case where maybe they would lose their permit is if they get like code violations or don't remit taxes. In that sense, they'll not be able to get the permit back, but that is valid.
If an owner occupant with a short-term rental permit were to leave town for a year, go on sabbatical, and not renew their permit, they could just go through the permit renewal process under the proposed regulations the following year when they're
Yeah, and if they want to rent 120 days, they just apply for a regular STR.
That's correct.
A classic, STR classic.
STR Classic, that's right.
Although at that point, they may be on a long wait list. You
Yes.
know,
Yeah.
and may need to go back to the 60 to 90 days the residential permit allows them. You know, I think the real challenge is discussing how long do you need to be here to be a resident? You know, is it your past history and your years that you have been here, or is it how long you're living here now? And that question I hit Philip with again later on is, well, if a owner occupied got a short-term rental and short-termed it for 90 days, and really still wasn't going to be here because they don't like the cold winter or whatever it would be, could they long-term rent their unit for the other 6 months and live here 3 months when it's beautiful, and the summers when it's not wildfire season? And but it's getting narrower and narrower.
12 months, doesn't it?
But you know, that would be nothing legally against renting long-term for that time period, but it would run into the question of whether you actually are a resident anymore, because your own physical abode was no longer available to live in for that 6 months plus 1 day. Is that pretty accurate?
Yes.
Thank you.
And, excuse me, one more thing. The enforcement. Do you base your enforcement on sales tax revenues, or how do you verify that somebody's rented their property 90 days or less?
There's an element of sales tax compliance that is based on the honor system. It's one of the last things in our society, I think, that is based on the honor system. But that, without running an audit, you don't know. And we are not aware of any means by which the platforms can be compelled to convey rental data to us. And even if they could, sometimes people go outside of the platforms. And so it's the honor system and audits to back them up.
Yeah, I was going to say, and enforcement.
Correct.
Okay. Well, we're looking for direction for staff recommendation here.
Yeah, this one's is tricky, and I think there's answers kind of all over the board. You know, my initial thought in looking at this was that sort of the best STR, so to speak, from the value of the community is actually the person just renting a bedroom, right? Because it's the lowest cost, it's most integrated with community, and so this would prohibit somebody from doing that on a regular basis, right? So, you know, you live here year-round, but you want to rent out your extra bedroom. More,
I'm not sure is that allowed currently?
So under the current regulations, you cannot rent a portion of a house.
yeah, but people are doing it, and it's still a good thing for the
Correct.
community.
And under the draft regulations, you would be able to rent a portion of a house.
Right.
The limitation we're talking about with this particular question is the number of days per year you could rent that portion or the entirety of your house.
Short-term.
Right, but in the case of you live here 365 days a year and you want a short-term, a bedroom, this is saying you would be limited to, in this case, 60 to 90 days of doing that.
correct,
Right.
yes.
And so my initial reaction is like, well, that doesn't sound like a good thing, because that's the STR that is of most benefit to the community. But as I, thought about it more, it also serves as an encouragement for that individual who is here year-round to rent it out long-term for the year.
For the other 9 months.
Which is arguably a better thing for the community. And then I think about the workplace dynamics shifting and changing, and people are going to want to travel more because they are going to be able to work remote, and that's like one of the best changes that's happening in our world. And so, do we want to limit our homeowners in their ability to do that? I don't think we do. The flip side to that, of course, is if we end up in a place where everyone has a primary residence, because this is the most return you can get per dollar, and then none of us are actually here, well, what community are we returning to anyways? So this one, to me, is like the most crystal ball, right? We just don't know how this is going to shake out. So kind of where I'm coming down is if there's anyone we want to give benefit to financially, it is our local residents. And so I would actually look to a higher number to start, something under that legal requirement of, 365 divided by 2, but higher than 90, so that we provide the most potential benefit to our local community. But this would be a place where I would be really looking at that data over the next 2 years and say, well, how are people using these? And is our community trending let's look at the quantifiable over the next 2 years of how this is being used, but then let's also feel into the qualitative of, does our community feel like it's becoming more or less of a community, and do we need to change that number based on that? That's sort of where I come down, but I'm not coming down in a really firm way because I just think there's so many known unknowns here. So that's sort of where I am, but yeah.
I had the same notes here. I was looking at the possibility of 120 days, feeling like that's the 4 months, 2 months of peak season, summer and winter. But for the sake of moving this conversation forward, shall we support staff recommendation to bring back our next phase of looking at this in an ordinance form with what is recommended here, and then we can have that discussion further at the table?
The only way my mind is gonna, and again, I'm not super firm on this, so I'm happy to kind of go along, but my mind is only gonna change with either staff coming back with different recommendation with more research, or from the persuasion of you guys. So just saying, let's go with staff and coming to the next one, I'm kind of back to the same conversation, and so like, why have it later rather than now? But I'm comfortable with moving forward that way.
Tori, the one thing that really strikes me is the effect of the income production in terms of long-term housing costs and affordability. But to the extent that we're saying, hey, a local free market resident can really only afford to live here if we can rent for 60 days, is one thing. And then to say, but let's raise it up to 120 days, let's double it. It's like basically doubling the sales price of that home because somebody else is going to think, I can buy it and I'll wait in line and then I'll STR it. And so at what point are we just driving our own property tax assessment rates up for the people who live next door who don't rent? Because there's not going to be any discrimination in the assessor's office when they come up with the state, your new property value is based on the market conditions, and those are what homes sold for in your surrounding area and your comparables. And so the person who's not renting at all is going to be losing out so much when their property valuation goes up $300,000 in a year, because that's what the neighbors are being paid. People are paying to buy in at. So I just really worry about what is the effect? Is it more of the death of 1,000 cuts? Or, can we have a death of just 500 cuts? I mean, the town is changing so quickly. But that's my concern, is at what point, you know, and we're already at the level where STRs do not pay a commercial property tax. And they are running as commercial operations potentially for 90 days a year. It's a huge advantage to those homeowners already that they're not paying the commercial property tax for an income-producing property. And I don't think we'll ever know if they even pay Colorado income tax on it. Is going to be reported income or not. And as I've said before, you know, if you're not, it's just the slow death of town.
Do you support the staff recommendation?
I do support the staff's recommendation, but it's pretty much a range. They've asked us to narrow it down from 60 to 90 days.
They're at 90.
They're at 90.
They're at 90. And again, this is just coming back to us. We're gonna.
I can support
because
90.
I can hear you're almost advocating like, hey, let's even think about less. And that's all I'm asking here is that we can instruct them to move forward with the 90, and then, hey, maybe it's less. You know,
I can compromise at 90, but it also relates back to how many we're going to allow in town later on. I don't want our next meeting to be a real back and forth over details that we haven't gotten to.
Yeah, we're not handcuffing ourselves and throwing away the key. We can always make changes in the future
Yeah.
based on what these regulations deliver to the community.
Yeah. Okay,
90 days seems.
so yeah, you can bring it back with staff recommendation.
I do support staff recommendation.
And again, I would just say that you can, everybody's like,
Yeah, and I
on it.
recognize, you know, there's some differences of opinion here, and it doesn't feel like it's 100% settled in terms of the number. I will suggest to council, and we can put some thought into this. We have not conceived of another way to quantify or qualify this particular topic in a way that can help you understand how it might play out. Beyond some of the policy analysis that we've done. Without information about the number of these we expect to have in town, it's a little more art than science at this point.
It seems to me that in the different kind of trade-offs we're talking about, the one that has the ability to bring the most science to is what are we encouraging in terms of use pattern between long-term rental of an extra space versus short-term rental of an extra space, and that's something that we could approximate at different day ranges of rental allowability. You know, you can't assume that they're going to choose the 90 highest days, right? Because people aren't going to leave at 15 different times a year to make that happen. So you kind of have to take an average to make it work. You can do that. The art, though, and Rachel, it's a great point, right? Because we've talked about this in terms of a STR, bless you. Which is there is the aspect of the artificial inflation of a price in expectation of a return. And, you know, in my mind, I'm thinking about the use case of someone buys the thing and then because of the changing workforce dynamics, you know, they basically spend their earn to travel or do other things. But you're right, it will have an effect on the sale price. And at what point are we just chasing the dragon and then forcing people to leave in order to do it? And that's the part that's totally art, right? I mean, we aren't going to know. It's good that we're thinking about it, but that's like the next 2 years are where the data is going to come in. And so the question really becomes more, what's our starting point, knowing that it's going to change than anything?
Chasing the dragon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I need more, right? It's I think it's a heroin reference.
I would
It's
just
not
point
great.
out that if a unit is rented for 90 days on a 7-day turnover, the remaining neighbor who isn't renting is going to have 12 different sets of visitors next to them in that 3-month period. You know, that's the impact that person gets. And you take it up to 120 days, they're going to have just short of 20 different neighbors to tell them, no, that's not where you put the trash, or, you know, no, please keep your dogs on the leash, or don't let me call the city to complain about the STR. You know, it's just that it's a lot of turnover in a residential neighborhood, and these are of unlimited number.
Just off the top of my head, we can look at Councilmember Mesereau's suggestion about the relationship between short-term and long-term rental, nights per year, rate of return. We can make some estimates around that. We can also conduct some estimates around approximate number of owner-occupied short-term rentals. Is it 100? Is it 250? Is it 500 in the community? And then translate that into rental nights per year and guests per bedroom to try and arrive at again, very approximate visitation numbers under different scenarios. Just to try and inform a little bit more discussion around this particular data point.
To
Yes.
inform the art side of things, we're doing $250,000 of public outreach. So it'd be really good to ask people, why are they currently short-term rentaling? Like, are they in the existing condition? Are they doing it to make their mortgage payment? Or are they doing it because they want to travel and it's an opportunity? And though they won't have this objectively, we can also ask them, right? Do you foresee one of those two reasons happening more or less frequently in the future?
We'll do our best to get as much data as we can for this discussion. Can I move on to the next topic? Thank you.
Please.
So policy question 4, just a moment, please, I'm gonna make some notes. So to the visitation concept, how many lodging beds are we talking about here? How many visitors does that translate into? What is the appropriate maximum occupancy for owner-occupied STRs and non-owner-occupied STRs? And to be clear, staff's not suggesting that we treat these differently in terms of occupancy. I just framed it that way to suggest that the occupancy limit would apply to both of these permit types. Again, from a policy standpoint, this helps the traditional lodging industry insofar as we'd be deferring to the traditional lodges and their occupancy limitations, as well as helping to support the visitor bed base. We'd be focusing tourist accommodations and their impacts in in more appropriate areas and at a sort of more appropriate and at least quantifiable scale. And then ensuring short-term rentals operate safely and in accordance with applicable regulations. Staff's recommendation is, again, rooted in best practice from other communities, as well as an assessment of the right balance between some of our competing policy priorities. And we arrived at the 2 per bedroom plus 1. And that plus 1 is not plus 1 per bedroom, that would be plus 1 per unit. So in the smallest conception of this, it would be 3 people in a studio, because a studio would constitute a 1-bedroom. In the largest conception, you could have a 10-bedroom house with 21 people in it.
Skippy.
How is enforcement done?
So
Occupancy police.
Ed checks.
I mean, really, though.
I get to go to the party at the 21-person house and count the people. No, I'm just kidding. So when you apply for a permit, you tell us how many bedrooms are in your unit. That number can be verified, or at least close to verified via the assessor's database. We would also inspect at some interval all the permits as they're applied for or throughout the course of a year to make sure that the information provided in the permit is accurate. So we can compare it to the assessor's database, that's one way, or we can go physically inspect the property. Okay. And then once it's operational, it would be sort of complaint-based, right? So if we had a sense that there were, if we got a complaint from a neighbor that there was some massive party going on at some house and there was tons of people around, we can verify. And if it's a 3-bedroom house and there's 9 cars parked in the driveway, maybe we need to go knock on the door and count the occupancy.
Got it. Okay. I mean, hearing all that, I appreciate that. I would suggest we go with the 2 plus 2. It's industry standard, like no one's going to put a single bed in their living room. They're going to put a queen sleeper sofa. It's just what it is. Sort of like, doing max occupancy for a standard sedan at 4 people. It's like, well, it's designed for 5. And it's just going to be hard to do. In terms of the party, you're not going to stop people from having people over for dinner. You're trying to figure out how many people are sleeping there. Totally different question. You're going to get a lot of complaints from people who, thought I saw 5, but I saw 6, or vice versa. It just seems to me that 2 plus 2 is the standard. It's the expectation. Let's not overcomplicate this. If it means we have more intensity of use, then maybe we need to drop that number of total allowable permits over time.
Okay, staff recommendation is 2 per plus 1. Skippy's suggesting maybe an alternative. Any
I want
input?
to listen for a second.
Okay.
I'm thinking about this one.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that the impact on the neighborhood is pretty substantial, and I support the staff recommendation.
John, thoughts?
Once again, staff recommendation makes good sense to me.
You know, thinking about it, and I take what you're saying seriously, but I think it's probably better to have a 2-bedroom plus 1, and folks knowing there's a kind of limit that, like the speed limit, they may go 5 miles over, as opposed to having a higher limit and then seeing them go over that limit to 2 bedrooms plus 3, you know, and feeling that there's just too much extra slack in there. But I do think, and I was going to raise it, I'm glad you raised it, there is a bigger issue that's happened in STRs in other places where one group will rent the STR and then have a blowout blast with a couple hundred people and practically destroy the house. And it's been a number of horror stories in the papers. But how do you respond to that? Has that just become a once the police are called because neighbors are upset? STRs, you know, it's kind of a temporary away from anything. The rules don't apply to us here. We're paying a lot of money. Let's do what we want. Attitude by a very small percentage of guests, but I think we're going to have some concerns with that going forward. You know, it's been in the tradition here, or even when people were renting a house for a month for $300,000 a night, that the owner would come back and find some pretty incredible damage to their property.
Okay, we'll move forward with staff recommendation. But I am on the side of what Skippy was saying. I think that there's a reality to this that is greater than our ability to enforce a lower limit. But I think Rachel makes a good point. So direction from council is to come back with staff recommendation.
Thank you.
Can I just say one more thing on that?
Yeah.
Which I appreciate. The party impact is different than this, right? That's sort of our enforcement and oversight. So we'll do that no matter whether there's 2 or 4 people in a studio or 6 or 8 in a 3-bedroom. I would just say we want our regulations to work. And so, you know, Ward or John, if the concern is that too many people is impact, then I would say you should go with just 2 per bedroom, because you can actually verify when you go do a walkthrough that there's not a sleeper sofa in there. As soon as you have that bed, like you're just, it's not ever gonna work with the +1.
Yeah, I'll keep
what it's
that in
worth.
mind when we get to the final. You guys both make good points.
Yeah, I think speed limit's 50, everybody goes 59.
Yeah.
Yeah, but in this case, we're talking about a difference in hardware, not just youth behavior, if we want it to be effective in any way of oversight.
This is a small change that, as people think about it some more and come back, may be reaffirmed in their minds where they stand now, or they might want to reconsider. So we'll move forward with staff recommendation.
Thank you. Last question from staff to council about the use it or lose it policy. Again, conceptually, this would be some time frame. Staff recommends 2 years of 0 tax filings would result in the abandonment of your permit. And that would apply to owner-occupied and short-term rental permits. This supports, again, making sure the lodging bed base is actually providing lodging beds to our visitors. It supports the attrition model insofar as it creates another lever or path by which permits can be made available to people on the wait list, or permits can be reduced to the capped number set by council. It incentivizes the use of permits, which translates into, again, visitor beds, as well as taxes for the community to support public goods, and economic activity to support our commercial sector. And finally, it increases fairness for properties that are on the wait list, because again, it creates another path to obtaining a permit. Again, staff's recommendation is 2-year policy. This is again based on best practice research, correct? And to use 0 tax filings as the trigger for that use it or lose it policy.
Thanks. Questions, comments, input?
I really think it should be shorter period of time, and as I was saying before, even just initial rules for the first year. But I would kind of feel like if somebody's gotten their permit after this is passed for 2023 or fall of 2022 and 2023, and they haven't had a tax to file within 9 years. Now, I don't know, do you file quarterly or just once annually on this sort of thing? How far does the filing process work? We might have to find that out.
I was looking for Tricia McIntyre.
Yeah, we can take a look at that at the second meeting if we need to. But I would like to have us look at something that's a little tighter, especially the first year, because if people have just applied for them on the, well, maybe, and then there's people who are on a wait list and like, I really am waiting for this, it's important to me. I don't want to say they have to wait for 2 years to find out. And you know, as we've talked about, you can reapply if it's that owner occupied one and you've decided to go away for a year. So I just say sooner.
Thank you.
Do you have a response for that at all? What's the flavor from your side?
I guess the only counterpoint is 2 years affords more time for people to be flexible in the way that they use their property. You could think of the example of a currently vacant second home where somebody decides, hey, there's a global pandemic, maybe I want to go live in my house. And do we want to afford that person the flexibility to be able to do that? And that is purely a policy question. There's no regulatory or sort of statutory requirement that the city would need to follow in order to set that standard.
Well, there would be nothing to prevent them from using their own house if they stopped renting it. The real question is about whether they want to maintain a permit.
Absolutely.
And it kind of sounds a little bit like, we're halfway between this system of medallionizing liquor licenses. Obviously, these can't be transferred, so it's not like someone's going to pay someone for their liquor license. But at the same time, you have someone who could potentially get their license, their liquor license, and then close their door for 18 months and say, well, I'll use it when I reopen. And otherwise, other businesses might be saying, but I want a license, and people are saying, but the neighborhood's served. And so it's a little challenging that way, as you're saying, in terms of, is it really providing the bed base it was supposed to? Is it fair to people waiting on the wait list? And they're just have it in their back pocket and waiting till rental rates go up? I don't know. So I can understand the fairness issue you're looking for, but again, someone could make that choice. I really want to live there, or maybe I want to rent and I'll use my short-term rental income to pay for me to rent somewhere else, But to be able to say I'm in the catbird seat and I can have it and I cannot use it, and other people can't have it because I'm not using it, doesn't feel right to me.
And the zero tax filing threshold's pretty low. You could rent your place for 3 days and meet the standard.
Yeah, I mean, you raise a point, should there be some sort of minimum usage of an STR permit as opposed to just zero usage or 100%? Is there something in between that says that this isn't really, I was going to say hitting the cap, because they got a permit, they could rent it year round, and they only rented it for 3 days, and yet somebody else still doesn't have a permit. So maybe we should look at some sort of threshold or actual use numbers as we get there. Thank you.
John?
Let's do this.
Staff recommendation of 2 years. You're cool staying there. Rachel's, opening conversation about a tighter window frame and lack of use for 1 year to be a forfeit.
Well, on the one hand, I can understand how they would want to wait for 1 year because that's a standard unit of time, filing taxes and so on. I wonder if there's a way to make it a year and a half instead of 2. Because I think 2 years is too long. But I understand why you would want it to be more than 1.
My guess is the finance department would like it to at least be in quarter of year increments, whatever that is, but
That makes logical sense as well.
with this particular type of regulation, we're again making art, not science, so we can frame it however council thinks is gonna best support their policy objectives.
Other input?
It seems like the owner-occupied STRs are a moot point anyway, since they're not capped.
That's correct.
So I would just exclude that. And so this applies to STR Classic. And I think that 3 season, okay, Icon or Classic. But 3 rental seasons make sense. You know, you have a summer, a winter, and if you don't rent them for 3 rental seasons in a row. So and you could have Pete break that down however you want to, but I'm in support of having it less than 2 consecutive years.
Less than 2, got it.
And would others like our staff to kind of take a look at, should there be a minimum amount of tax filing, or is 0 the magic number? Because, you know, if someone was able to hold on to a permit for a year and a half, and I rented it to a friend for 3 nights for $75 a night, and now I can keep my permit for another 2 years, is that what we're looking for? You know, so I think again, I would give it to staff to take a little look at, but should there be some sort of minimal amount of use to have shown that it's worth keeping that permit away from someone else using it?
Mm-hmm.
Some people are always going to game it.
I know, but you can at least put some construct around the game.
I can support giving that to staff to think on. I don't know if there's other examples of that or not, but to have your, you know, looking at that, I'm all for that. I can support that. For me, I don't want this to become something that encumbers it even more. We have a lot of work that's going to be going on in this space, so I'm happy starting with staff recommendation, but I think you guys make great points that 2 years may be a little on the lengthy side.
Years are burning.
Yeah.
I thought Philip was doing an excellent job on the financial questions. Thanks, man. Really kicking the butt. I was just kind of coming up on the last comment about, I'm sorry, catching my breath at the same time.
Those stairs, I'll tell you, they're getting everybody
I feel
today.
like you're in good shape.
By the way, this is Pete Strecker. He's the finance director for the city of Aspen.
And marathon runner. My running days. The question on kind of like a minimum filing threshold, I think, is something that's been discussed lately, and I think there's a good one to suggest. We could look at an average room rate times so many days to kind of back into maybe a threshold as opposed to just strictly 0. We did have a conversation last Friday with another community, and they actually had implemented something in their policy when they adopted a new tax that said that they had to have a 30-day minimum for the rental of that unit to kind of maintain the permit. Actually pegging the number of days is actually very difficult to actually enforce.
Right.
But if you make an estimate on the amount per room or per nightly stay, and then base that on whatever tax rate you decide on and everything else, you could say a minimum tax threshold would be X.
Thank you for that, Pete. I just wanted it looked at. And the other thing that strikes me is that, you know, if you went to the opposite end of that and said, hey, let's leave it at 2 years, maybe, hate to even say it, you have a 4th permit, which would be an owner-occupied de minimis permit where they only rent for 14 days a year and that's all they're allowed, and, you know, whether they do a tax filing or not. But, I mean, if you really are down to people who only think, I'm going to be away for 2 weeks at Christmas, or we're going away for, you know, maybe 3 weeks, 3 weeks in July, should they be competing with people who are going to be renting either year-round or 90 days and this sort of thing? I mean, that would be another way to get to people who want the permit but really only plan on renting it once a year, you know?
Yeah, the enforcement question really becomes difficult at that point because you cannot
really, unless you start auditing every single STR, which is something I do not have staff for, we wouldn't be able to identify those that play correctly versus those that don't.
Okay, well, thank you.
Agreed with Ward, we should strike the owner occupied from this, it's kind of irrelevant. And I agree with both of what you guys said. I do not want to create a situation where we prohibit a non-primary resident from coming here for a year, from testing out our community, whether it's a pandemic or a job switch, and spending a full year to get the flavor of it and decide maybe they do want to move here. So I don't want to prohibit that. On the flip side, I don't want to see an STR sit vacant for a year. So if there's a way to have our cake and eat it too that's easy in the regulation to have that exemption, so to speak, great, bring that back. If there's not an easy way to do that, I'm happy to accept 2 years or a year and a half as the way we find that out. And again, like all these things, we're going to be learning a lot about actual use in the next couple of years, and we can make changes at that time.
Based on my tallies,
Yes.
I'm hearing support for less than 2 years. I have not heard 3 for supporting some sort of minimum tax filing standard.
I was just
So
asking
w-
you to bring back information about that.
Yeah, I'm at this point in the process, our ability to conduct additional analysis is fairly constrained, and so without a majority of council desiring that policy perspective, I would be very hesitant to conduct that analysis at this time.
Okay.
Sounds like we'll come back with a proposal for less than 2 years for council consideration at first reading.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Pete, and you're welcome to
Thanks,
stay if you'd like. That's it for us this evening. Those are the primary questions that we needed answers to before we get into an ordinance, but of course, as always, we want to afford you an opportunity to ask any additional questions or make other suggestions for staff consideration. And again, anything that comes out of this could be translated into language at first reading on the 24th.
Great, thank you guys. And thanks for everyone who's in the room.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Council. We appreciate your
Thank
time
you,
this
guys.
evening.
Thanks.
Chopping out.
Board report.
We have
Before I go, interviews.
board interviews. We're going to go ahead and just take a few minutes. Let's take 4 or 5 while we get switched over. And we've got, I think, three different boards to interview. Haley, great job. Philip, great job.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Complexity and distilling it down.
I needed to step in.
Thanks very much. Thanks for staying with us. Welcome back. We just took a quick recess between our two topics. We are now on to item number 2 on our agenda, which are board and commission interviews. The first one I have in front of me is P and Z, and a couple of applicants, Thomas Gorman, Jason Suazo. Are we in the neighborhood? If you're here, come on up. We're gonna have you up together. You can just take a seat right here at this front table. We had 2 other applicants for this board, but they are not able to attend this evening. We have 2 regular openings and 2 alternate openings. And like I said, we have 2 other applicants, but they're not able to make the meeting tonight. Welcome to both of you guys. Thank you so much. Thomas, Jason, first of all, thank you so much for your interest in applying. As I always say, our volunteer boards and commissions are part of what makes Aspen so special, because it's community involvement, but it's also a chance for our citizens to participate in governance and really building and constructing their own community as we go forward. So thank you, first and foremost. The first question that I have, that I ask is, are you aware of the meeting schedule, the roles and responsibilities of P and Z, and can you make those meetings?
For you on that?
Yes, I can make the meeting.
Great.
I will make the meeting.
Those are Wednesday evenings.
Okay.
Mr. Gorman?
So to this point, I was not, but I can make meetings.
Okay. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to other council members for questions.
Thank you guys both. We don't do snacks often. It's very exciting for me. Just the general, what attracted you to, what attracts you to serving on P&Z, and why now?
I think that's a really good question because I wrestled with this a little bit. And the best answer I have is that a couple of years ago, my wife and I did Citizens Academy and learned a lot about how city government works. And at the conclusion of the program, we were asked, I think there were about a dozen of us, to consider board service as part of a way to give to the community. And I did, in fact, put my name in the last cycle, so that would have been late 2019, early 2020. And I had gotten the impression that I was accepted, but nothing happened. So here I am again. You know, it's in some sense not rational to give one's time, but in the other sense, because we live in this community and it's a special place, the only way we can keep it special, I think, is by making whatever contribution we can. Now I am retired, I have time, I can do this kind of work to build a stronger community.
Yes, I agree. It's probably the most important thing in this community, planning and zoning, I think, personally. And yeah, I work in the property management field, and all my close associates, my friends, are planners, you know, Ben and I. So yeah, it's like kind of the conversation we gravitate to, sitting around the kitchen table as this, and I'm fascinated by it, and I want to get my feet wet.
Go around the horn. No one answers.
Well,
Ask,
real
I'll
quick,
come
just
back.
about, Jason, how long have you lived in Aspen or the Valley?
12 years.
12 years. Great. Rachel?
Thank you. The Aspen Area Community Plan has always called for a balance between affordable housing and the needs of the business community, and the goal of having a sustainable community from generation to generation, including children and seniors who've worked their lives here. Do you agree with those goals, and do you support the creation of additional affordable housing in all the zone districts within Aspen to kind of catch up on the shortfall we're experiencing?
Yes. I live in Apsha. I have an ownership unit at Centennial. I have a child at the ELC. I totally support more affordable housing.
Okay. I don't have a particular view as to whether more or less housing is kind of an essential goal, but if the community plan supports it, then I would feel that it is a board member's duty to follow the dictates of the plan.
Thank you. Just a follow-up question. The community plan does also call for urban growth boundary around Aspen, goes out to and extends, catches the airport business center. Do you support having an urban growth boundary? And if so, why? And if not, why would you want to modify that?
I think I would give the same answer, that if the community plan has set that as a priority for the town, then I think it would be the duty of a commissioner to carry out the dictate.
Okay, thank you.
Right, I would agree with that statement. It's probably above the pay grade.
Thank you both. I'll let others ask questions.
John, Ward?
Blues Brothers, wasn't that Winnetka, Illinois?
Well, let's see. Some of it was probably filmed there, but yes.
Well, this is a great mix right here. I think, you know, the Aspen Area Community Plan is a guiding document, but Title 26 is what your real guiding document with P&Z is. What I've asked of other members that come on to P&Z is that as you go through Title 26 and you see where there should be some improvements, that you inform the council where we can change the land use code if it's not what it should be. And so I thank you both for your willingness to serve. In serving on a voluntary board really gives you an anchor in the community. So I didn't really have any questions for either of you. Thank you both for your willingness to serve. And are you applying for an alternate or a permanent?
I would apply for permanent.
Sure, I would prefer a permanent.
Okay.
Thanks, Ward. John?
I'm just going to throw out a softball question. Let's say a proposal came forward that required a zoning change. Would you support the zoning change? Let me think of how to rephrase this. Would you be more likely to support the zoning change if it supported business or the community?
Care to take that one?
The community.
I would look at the individual issue and try to take apart the constituent pieces of that problem. I don't necessarily think that business and the community are always in opposition. Sometimes they work together. Sometimes their interests are opposed. So I think I would have to see what it was.
Thanks.
I think Skippy's seen this on P&Z, and we see it at the council table a lot, that people come in with a story. And I would encourage you to look at the rules, look what the land use code is, and not get sold on the story.
Have either of you attended P&Z meetings in the recent past?
Not me.
Negative.
Are you aware of any of the P&Z rulings or judgments that they have made recently? Have you been paying attention to any of P&Z's activities if you haven't attended meetings?
Well, we have a situation that may have been a P&Z not far from where I live, also not far from where Skippy used to live, on East Cooper, in the 1000 block. And I think that has been back and forth on a couple of levels and commissions to try to get resolution. I don't have a dog in that particular fight, but I'm aware it's going on.
Thank you.
Yeah, not really, just conversations, but specifics, no.
All right. Rachel?
Yeah, a question, a softball again for both of you, but what skills or talents or point of view issues would you particularly bring to the Planning and Zoning Commission?
I would say if you want someone well-versed in code and kind of inside government, I'm not the guy. I am doing this out of interest for the community. I anticipate doing it for one term. And I anticipate something of a learning curve because, at least as an outsider, zoning is a thicket of painstakingly arrived at rules done over a long period of time and represent a balance between a lot of different interests, sometimes competing interests, sometimes cooperative interests. And to me, is the sort of place that would call for incrementalism and careful study rather than drastic action in most cases.
Thank you.
Yeah, I guess I would bring careful study to this. I'm interested. I want to put my all into it. I guess it relates to my business a little bit as a property manager, and I'm fascinated by it, and I'm a community member, and I think it's probably the most important avenue of this discussion recently. I want to be involved
Thank you.
however I can.
Thanks. More follow-up, Skippy?
Just last question. As you guys just one last question. As you guys, I'm back in the neighborhood as of yesterday.
Oh, good.
Have you know? I'm very excited about that. As you guys in your individual lives have just sort of looked at the development that's happened, over the last, let's say, 5 years, roughly, commercial, residential, where are we as a community going right? And what are we getting wrong, or what do we have areas for improvement in? Because you will, in addition to enforcing the existing land use code, you also hopefully will be making recommendations to us for areas for improvement.
You want to take this first?
Don't be coy.
Goodness. I don't want to be negative and say you haven't done anything right.
No. Feedback is feedback, but no, it's important to know kind of what your perspective on the trajectory of town, and maybe it is all bad, I don't know, but my guess is there's good and bad.
We're only responsible for 3 years' worth of trajectory.
One thing that I would look forward to participating in is looking at the transition of the town's economy from really tourist-driven to something resembling well, I'll call it a Winnetka, Illinois, with I'd say more a permanent base of residents. We see some of that as people are moving into the valley that can work from anywhere. I don't know if it's yet reflected in school enrollment and sort of other critical aspects, but I think it would have the potential to even out the ups and downs of our calendar and give us perhaps a more just a base that we could rely on as we do our planning. So that would be something that would interest me, is how that might be facilitated from here.
Yeah, I guess I'm encouraged by what you guys are doing with like the moratorium on scrape and replace, for example. Next door has scraped and replaced a perfectly fine house, in my opinion, to build another perfectly fine house and fill up the landfill. What you could improve on is, obviously I live in Apsha and it's not the greatest. It's a place to live, but it doesn't make me happy to go home every night. So I feel like I would encourage the council to work on that.
Thank you, guys, both of you.
All right. Thank you guys so much. We'll be in touch soon.
Good, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again.
I'm happy to say I live in a scraper.
Yeah, only in this town, maybe.
Next up is our Kids First Board, Logan. Good to see you.
See you.
It's been a little while.
It has been.
Council, this is Kids First Advisory Board, and we are one alternate member is what we're looking for.
Shirley.
Logan, my question always is, you're aware of the meeting schedules and you have no conflict there and you're able to make meetings.
Yeah, I definitely looked through that before committing and showing up here. And I learned that this is an alternate position, so it's even I put my name in the hat, I thought I'd still show up because you need alternates. So,
Thank you.
yeah, that works for me.
You know, in my experience, alternates end up voting quite a bit because
Okay.
people take vacations or they have things come up and they can't attend. So even as an alternate, it's important to attend to be able to follow the issue for when you are called on to vote. And you certainly can express all your opinions or agreement or disagreement and influence an argument whether or not you can vote during the discussions
Well,
of
that's
the
good to
board.
know.
So,
Okay,
yeah,
great.
it's not as if you have to sit in a corner.
Okay, good.
I really appreciate you applying, and you have a great resume, and your experience and love of kids and community and people really shows through. What I was going to ask is, do you foresee any conflict with that potential role and your role with the county?
That's a great question. Well, recently, Community Health Services, which I'm the director for at this time, and we were kind of a interim, hi Shirley, I see you're on the call. We were the interim nurse consultant for Kids First as there was a gap in a staff member. So it really gave me an insight into what is going on really at the city level. So it really, I think, enhanced more than deterred maybe what I could offer. As far as a conflict of interest, if there was any kind of funding decision, I would have to be exempt from probably one of the grantees, which is where my son attends school at Growing Years in Basalt. So for things like that, I would be aware of and definitely remove myself if that was a voting decision and exempt myself from that and sign a conflict of interest policy if there is one or something like that to be
Sure.
fully transparent.
Yeah, no, I think that's fairly common practice, and a lot of applicants for this board have children. A surprise.
Yes, surprise.
Yeah. So, okay, great. Well, let me follow up with one other question, kind of wide open. But what skills or talents do you believe you would bring to the board?
Yeah, I think what I bring to the board is I've been in the Valley for over 15 years. My partner is born and raised in Basalt, so I've been here for a while in the nonprofit world ever since. Very much family-based and children and especially accessibility to health programs typically. But in my role right now at Community Health Services, what I could really bring is kind of infusing some of that parent education around child health, especially around routine immunizations and vaccines, which often a lot of times is changing. Well, not so much changing, but just being kind of really there at the forefront with any kind of changes to maybe inform parents and support the school. When I was at the Aspen Community Foundation, I did run a mobile preschool. It was the first licensed mobile preschool in the state of Colorado. And so working with licensed programs, I'm very familiar with a lot of the licensing rules and regulations. For quality, health, and safety of a center. Also, I think I bring a nonprofit, maybe leadership perspective. I also think I'm an advocate for young children and their health and well-being, the whole child, not just so much just this routine, but mental health or infusing parent education around child abuse prevention, dental health. I mean, kind of a full circle of child's health and well-being, but that also really weaves into my experience with working with families, the very fabric of our community who is using affordable, accessible childcare to really give back to the workforce. So a lot of my positions I've held in my nonprofit experience has been, I think, really kind of lends itself to provide some support to the community if I can. I am on the board of Growing Years Preschool, so again, that I think being on that school board, I'm getting an experience. What are common things that families are struggling with, or what are some of these policies that are changing all the time? But also, I think most importantly, how to keep, retain, and recruit quality teachers. That's a passion of mine, and I also ran a preschool, so knowing what that's like, it's hard work, and so that's, how we can keep this program going. And so I think a lot of what I care about and have a passion for is exactly what the shared vision of Kids First is, and that's making a difference for accessible and affordable childcare.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for applying and
Yeah.
the willingness to serve. I can tell you that being an alternate carries every bit as much weight as being a normal member, because you have a full voice on the board. Sometimes you may not be able to vote, but you can influence, and it's on any of the boards I've been on, it's very rare that it's one vote between yay or nay. And I think that you would have very good company, as the other alternate is very close to me.
Okay. Oh, really? Okay, great. Thank you.
Just based on your resume, it seems you're extremely qualified, and I think you're just the type of person who would fit well on the Kids First board. Thanks for applying.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. Skippy?
You know a lot about this area.
I do.
What, to your mind and knowledge base, is our #1 area for improvement for childcare in the Valley?
Oh, good question. Well, just in my experience of right now, I have a 3-year-old son. I was fortunate and privileged to get him into an infant center. And there's a long wait list. And I think the crux of the problem is that there's a workforce out there that isn't coming to the table because they can't get infant care. And having qualified teachers that are trained and certified in working with infants, that's a hard age, but also really creating kind of like this pipeline of high quality programming that once they're starting in a program, they can really stay and evolve and get to know the family. So I think, like so much in our valley, there's limited space. I think there's a group of families that need affordable. And affordable doesn't mean so much tuition assistance, which I think is great. Even those that are both working, it's difficult to afford childcare for. It's about 30% of even my own income that I'm paying for tuition so I can work full-time in the community. So looking at that structure and the pay structure, but then again, we have to pay teachers equitably so they can live here and not have to drive to Silt and, to live. It's a problem across the board for workforce, but I think if we're going to keep quality and retain teachers, we have to look at the infant capacity and retaining teachers. I think that it's not just a problem here, it's everywhere. But in this valley, I know for a fact just recently in Basalt alone, there's over 120 infants on a wait list. And those are clean wait list numbers. They're not just people that put their name on a list. It's actually calling them and saying, are you still in need of it? And they are. So those are folks not in the workforce, which could then evolve into such a bigger supportive community.
Thank you.
Thanks, Logan. I only have one question. What's the J stand for?
In the middle, Janelle.
Logan J.
My middle name is Janelle.
Thanks, Janelle.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So thank you so much, everyone, for having this opportunity and asking these questions and having the platform. Can I put on the record separately, thank you for your advocacy around giving to our nonprofits in our community. Community Health Services is one recipient that is going to be getting a grant. So thank you so much. And it's going to a great cause. So just wanted to put that in there.
Thank you.
Logan.
Thanks
Thank you,
a lot.
Logan.
Appreciate
Thank
it.
you. Thank you.
Counselor, our next board is Next Gen Advisory Board, and we have
Tyler's,
coming on up.
you get the most credit for seat time tonight.
How's it going?
Hi, Tyler.
Hey, how's it going?
Very good, thank you. I was, normally I ask, can you make the meetings? But the meetings right now, we're still setting schedule for that. Typically, we're Wednesdays, Wednesday evenings right now is when Next Gen is meeting. I don't know if you have any conflict on Wednesday evenings, but
Not right now.
that sounds great. Council, this commission is actually a board of 7 that is only at 4 currently. So we are looking for 3 regular members. Questions for Tyler? Start with Rachel.
Well, I was just going to say, you've already proven your ability to sit through long and boring meetings. So policy work is like that, and listening to others and trying to get a clear path forward on things. So I really appreciate that. I believe your comments in your application are really strong. I don't want to put an answer in your mouth, but what do you think the most pressing problem facing the younger generation in Aspen is?
Housing.
That surprises me.
Yeah.
Nailed
Never
it.
hear that.
Not-
Never
not-
hear that.
Nailed it.
Doing it all wrong with cat rescue up here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
Shocker,
So
right?
thank you very much on that, and your willingness to serve. I appreciate that. Are there anything particular you'd like to tell us as a board?
No, I think it's somewhat written out in my application and resume. I'm relatively new to Aspen, here 3.5 years. I run a production studio here, so I run a business. I have 1 employee. Although when we have shoots, we'll scale up to 20 to 25. Sort of the freelance economy is how that world works. But before my old job, I had a suit and tie job working in politics in Vermont. So I spent a lot of time
In boring policy
and
meetings?
listening to committee hearings. That's what I did all day long. And so I guess for me, this is sort of dipping a toe in Aspen. I can't say I understand all the issues and the histories, and fairly new to town, but I do have a background in some of this. I represent a few clients related to affordable housing, solid waste district as well. We also had a lot of business clients, but they're not as relevant to issues in Aspen. So I do have a policy background, and I think wanting to join this board is just to sort of dip my toes in the water, get a feel for what's happening in Aspen. Obviously, I think housing is, particularly in the short term, I think is before some of these, new affordable housing projects can come online, it's going to get pretty bad. I live at Waters Avenue. I came home this weekend to stacks of probably a dozen mattresses out by our dumpster of people who lost their housing this weekend. And so I think the short term is going to be particularly challenging, and I think before I came to Aspen, I lived briefly in Telluride, and I think that is an interesting model of a town on a smaller scale than here that has less ability to absorb a crisis like we have at Aspen. But there you saw this past fall, when the high school kids and college kids went back to work, they 3 or 4 restaurants and coffee shops just gave up. They said, we're done. We're closing our doors. Those are empty businesses now still. That hasn't happened here, but
Getting close.
we're getting close. Yeah, you're already start to see, we do have more year-round residents, yet more of the restaurants are closed for off-season right now just to give their workers a break. You see more of this, one person gets sick or calls in, can't make it, the restaurant closes for the night, or you're going to start seeing Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, we're not open, and
Right.
I just, I don't know, that's,
Cascading effects.
yeah, yep,
Yeah. Thank you.
yep.
This way?
Thank you for your willingness to serve. Do you know any of the current members on the Next Gen board?
I don't know.
Okay.
I emailed them asking initially, why is there only 4 of you guys? I thought there were 7, and they said, well, yeah, you should join. But I actually don't know any of them personally. I saw the names, but I don't know them. And I think when I emailed, they said they weren't meeting because of COVID at the time, which was a couple months ago. It took me a while to actually get all this stuff in order with the,
Yeah, I think Next Gen has been pretty dormant for a while.
yeah.
And I wonder if you are appointed, if you have an idea of where you would like to focus your attentions as a board.
I mean, I think, advocating, I believe, to all of you what I hear from my peers and people in town who frankly aren't going to come to a city council meeting. So I think being more of an ear for what I hear, amongst people of my age group. And then I think, for me in particular, just trying to get a better feel for, even just coming here and listening, the short-term rental things, obviously, quite the pressure on housing for longer-term housing. So, it's hard for me to say. I don't know too much of what the board's been up to in the past, so it's hard for me to, I guess I said at first is, I think come to listen before I present too many ideas, I guess would be my first thing.
Yeah, I think that it's more of a nascent board than anything, since it has been dormant, and the people that are on the committee now, our next gen now, are new members. So
Okay.
it really does need direction. And so if you're a group player, a team player, if you could get together with the people that are on the board and come up with something that you could really focus your energies on, I think would be a benefit to the community in general and to the age group that you represent.
Yep. I think that sounds reasonable. I think, I'm curious to hear more about what they have been up to. I think there's obviously a survey, but a more formalized way probably of presenting and generating the concerns or opinions of people who, like I said, of a younger demographic, or my demographic is probably the next step, I would say.
I think this is probably the only board I can ask this of, since there is an age limit. How old are you?
33.
Okay, good. Good.
Yep. We got plenty of time. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
No, I agree with what Ward was saying. It seems like next gen needs direction and needs leadership.
Cool.
So maybe you're the guy who can bring it to the next gen board. Thanks for applying.
Yeah.
Next Gen historically has been you get out what you put into it in terms
Sure.
of time. And so Tori mentioned the meetings, but there's often work available outside of meetings. So I'm just curious, with your job and schedule and preferences, what's your appetite for time commitment?
Well, my availability can fluctuate quite a bit because we're project-based, so obviously winter, leading up to winter, is very busy for us. Right now is a great time. It's actually, relatively slow. I guess it would depend on what that work is. I think we all prioritize what we find most interesting, so I would say it really depends on what that would be. I do run a business, so it's pretty time-consuming. Yeah, I think, it does, I think my interest in this board is just getting a feel for, city government in Aspen, knowing that, it hasn't been very busy recently, but not wanting to sort of overcommit and, sign up for something that I don't have time for. Sure. But I'd like to sort of get a feel for, for what other involvement opportunities there are. But yeah, I think it's really, again, going back to what your question was, it's where it would depend.
Yeah. Rachel suggested just giving you some, you don't have to respond to any of this, but, that has looked like before.
Yeah.
Things that come up. NextGen did a lot of advocacy around childcare, and so they did a lot of sort of background research of talking to and working with childcare providers, interfacing with the city council of the time and staff. Other example, NextGen was part of an effort to change our election day to increase voter turnout, and so there was a ballot initiative which required knocking on doors and designing letters and whatever. So, and gathering signatures. So it can vary. Housing has been a focus of NextGen for a long time. So those are kind of the three main area of foci, I would say, in the last several years. But the world is your oyster as a group to do what you will. Last question I have is, you mentioned policy work and just some governmental work in Vermont. And as I said, NextGen's kind of in a moment of the opportunity of a renaissance, a reformation. And so did you see any examples of successful activation of youth in the civic space in Vermont that may serve as a model or influence to NextGen moving forward?
Youth, I mean, that's a good question. I think, working in, so I worked for a lobbying law firm, and we worked in the state house. There was not necessarily like a youth-focused group that we represented. I would say like issues where there was a lot of youth involvement was, I would say, climate and guns. I did a lot of gun violence prevention, which is one way of saying opposing the NRA. That's one that. Those two areas were things that we had a lot of youth involvement, but I wouldn't say in general. I would say maybe city council is similar. You don't other than being pages. You don't see a lot of young people showing up, and I get why. It's not a very friendly place when you have to walk in and everyone wearing a suit and tie and walks really fast and talks in words you don't understand. So, but yeah, I wouldn't say there was a particular. Those are just two issues that youth were particularly interested in. I think in Aspen, housing is the one that people are most concerned about. Housing and affordability.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks, Todd. Appreciate it, man.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tyler.
Cool. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Tyler.
Awesome.
We will be in touch very soon.
Cool.
The next Gen meeting is on the 18th of this month.
Okay. Cool. Awesome.
Thank you.
All right, council, that is our agenda for the evening.
Bye,
See you
all.
tomorrow. I believe our meeting tomorrow is scheduled at 4 p.m. Yeah, our second reading of, yeah.
All right. Cheers, y'all.
Skippy, what's your day like tomorrow?